I'm generally quite averse when it comes to covering political topics, for the most part, because they tend to be quite transitory and they tend to shift the wind. But there are some topics, I think, that are of interest, and that's the reason why I'm talking about this topic today, namely the Constitution and freedom of speech and people's general attitudes towards it. Because this hasn't been simply a shift in the wind. This has been a gradual thing over time, and it has shifted in a way that I personally would perceive as fairly negative, as would many people who, generally speaking, support proper freedom of speech, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution more broadly. Now, I'm hardly a constitutional scholar, but as somebody who's close to 50, there's absolutely been a change in the long-term wind with respect to the Constitution and freedom of speech. And so this isn't just a fad, this is something much greater. It represents a fundamental cultural and historical shift away from something that used to be regarded by many people, not all people, as sacrosanct in the context of the United States. And to demonstrate this fundamental shift in the zeitgeist, I think it's best to bring up this very famous, infamous example from Skokie, Illinois, from the late 70s. So, give or take almost 50 years ago. Now, this incident involved proper neo-Nazis, that's how they were referring to themselves, not as people these days call everything neo-Nazis. Neo-Nazis, as they refer to themselves, in a suburb outside of Chicago called Skokie, with a large Jewish population. Many of them had been Holocaust survivors. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was called in to represent the actual neo-Nazis and their right to protest or demonstrate, or however you want to frame it, in this sleepy suburb of Chicago with this large Jewish population, as well as the fact that many of them were Holocaust survivors. Now, they actually went ahead and did that because, at the end of the day, the neo-Nazis who were marching were exercising their freedom of speech, their First Amendment, and there was nothing illegal about that, even though many of the people at the time almost certainly found it quite repugnant. And indeed, there was not necessarily consensus on every side at the time as to whether or not they, quote-unquote, should be able to do so. But clearly, as enshrined in the Constitution and the First Amendment, and as defended by the American Civil Liberties Union, they were well within their rights to do so, this group of neo-Nazis. Now, I want to fast forward from almost 50 years ago, this was the late 70s, to now, and I want you to try to imagine, if it's even possible, a scenario where anyone, let alone the ACLU does not do things like that anymore. They are now part of the, how should we put it, new cultural movement that is not a fan of freedom of speech. And that is a massive shift. And I think a lot of this has to do basically with, let's be perfectly honest, indoctrination. If you had grown up in the United States when I had grown up, or even earlier, then you probably had received the type of I pledge allegiance to the flag indoctrination that we all did. Namely, the idea that we were all, as Americans, whatever that means, but at the time at least, all unified under this notion of a cultural allegiance to the principles of the founding of the country, and specifically the Constitution, and even more specifically freedom of speech. And of course, there are also differences on how people perceive that, but in general, there were many more people at the time, and people who grew up during that era, who adhered to things like the Bill of Rights, and let's be perfectly honest, the quote-unquote sanctity of the Constitution. But the Constitution is just a piece of paper. And so in order to get people to believe in it and its value, you need to basically indoctrinate them. You need to raise them with a set of political beliefs that makes them believe in the value of this document. And what do we see today? Generally speaking, people, especially the youngest generation, Zoomers, but also millennials, care less and less about the value of this document and less about freedom of speech more broadly. And I think this is very telling because it in fact does tell us something about what freedom of speech is really all about at the end of the day, with a few exceptions. Those exceptions being people who are devoted to the so-called sacrosanct nature of the Constitution and the contents therein, such as the lawyers at the time from the ACLU. This has been a massive shift in the cultural zeitgeist. I think it bears mentioning that freedom of speech is one of the few good things when it comes to the United States. It is pretty damn unique, all things considered. If you think about other places in Europe, for example, Germany, France, even the United Kingdom, and you could say in large measure that much of the notion of freedom of speech, as we conceive of it in the context of the United States, originates in England, well, you can see in all these cases it's much more restrictive. And so it's a very particular cultural and historical tradition that the United States emerged from that allowed for this type of attitude. And now we see it shifting massively. What is the crux of the matter? It seems, broadly speaking, with a few exceptions, free speech absolutists, and I tend to be one for the most part, as well as the lawyers at the time working for the ACLU in the late 70s, it seems to be the case, broadly speaking, that for most people, freedom of speech is not more than a buzzword, and more properly, a cudgel that is used to beat other people over the head with when it suits their purposes and when it suits their needs. And what do I mean by that? Well, specifically, people are always worried about freedom of speech when it affects their speech. And so when we look at this shift in the cultural zeitgeist, we look at, say, the left in the 50s, the 60s, some degree in the 70s, these were people who were a political minority, and their views and such were also relegated to that political minority status. And so throughout this period in time, there were many people on the left who were strong advocates of freedom of speech. They were on the tail end of receiving attempts to restrict their freedom of speech. But what has happened now? A total 180. Now, almost everything, when we talk about broader institutions, education, government, you name it, has been infused with extreme left-wing politics. They're running the show. And as a consequence, they don't care very much about freedom of speech. Who cares about quote-unquote freedom of speech or freedom of speech these days? It's mostly people on the right, mostly people on the receiving end of restrictions or at least attempts to restrict them. Now, there is some conflation, broadly speaking, obviously on private platforms such as YouTube, Google, or even Twitter. You can't really have proper freedom of speech because they're privately owned. But in general, people who advocate for freedom of speech these days are almost certainly not going to be left-wing, with very few principled exceptions. And as I said before, even the ACLU has metamorphosed into something much more akin to what we might expect of an organ of the left, as it were, over time in 2024. And so the paradigm is very simple at the end of the day. If you are the underdog in the context of the United States, then typically you advocate for freedom of speech. If you're in charge, if you have authority, if you have power, you do not. And this is because different political polarities wish to exercise different types of authority. They wish to exercise different types of control. And in the mid-20th century, obviously, things tended to be more conservative, more right-wing. Now it's the polar opposite, to say the very least. And what do these people want to do? They want to exercise control. They want to make sure that that remains. And I know this for a fact. I've talked to many different people over the years. And I recall having a conversation with somebody on the extreme right, as in the very extreme right, who was very open with me and very honest and said, look, I'm only advocating for freedom of speech now until my group gets into power, so then we can basically crush the rights of freedom of speech of other people. And at least that's an honest answer, because other people might be a lot less willing to concede things like that. So underdogs advocate for freedom of speech. Overdogs, so to speak, do not, with a few exceptions. And that's what I mean about the cultural indoctrination. If you'd grown up during my era, the 70s and the 80s, or even before, you might have been the type of person who had heard about the value of the First Amendment and how important it is and how we're all united under the principles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But these days, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who even knows what the Bill of Rights is, or even in the most extreme cases, what the First Amendment represents. And so people just don't care anymore. In a sense, it is a social construct, as much as I hate that word. But in order to socially construct a wide-scale belief in something, you need time. And everything in the cultural zeitgeist has been shifting away from that, and that's how we got to where we are. The real question going forward, I think, is whether or not this can ever shift back. Now, theoretically, that's the case, but I am reluctant to say that it will, because I think we've had an unprecedented influence of the internet, of social media, that has fed a lot of the politics of our day. And if you'd asked me in an era without the internet, in an era that was basically not plugged in and not online 24/7, I would have said, sure, that's a normal thing. Political ideologies changing and political polarity shifting. But these days, with the power of the internet and how ensconced people have become in their respective bubbles, I don't see it happening. And so, whatever you might have believed about freedom of speech, if you're a principled believer in freedom of speech, such as myself, or you're on one of the many different sides of the political spectrum that simply wishes to have freedom of speech when it's convenient to you, either way, the broad cultural belief in freedom of speech as part of an American cultural heritage, as part of something that is essential to the United States, is dead, and it is not coming back. There's not going to be a resurrection of freedom of speech, or for that matter, a belief in the Constitution. Most people these days do not care about the Constitution. It's only old fogies, such as myself and others, who have even a whit of concern for this stuff. And I can assure you it's going to get even worse over time. Because again, that cultural indoctrination has shifted from one sort to another. Today, let's put it mildly, people are indoctrinated for a variety of other things in the United States. We don't need to go into it. And so you can forget about it. So it was a good run. Freedom of speech was a nice thing. But I think going forward, we're going to see a lot less of it, whichever side you're on. Of course, if you're on the receiving end and simply wish to wield power, that's a bad thing. But especially if you're a principled believer, it's really bad. And it's sad to see. But I thought this is an important topic to cover because it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, shifts in the cultural zeitgeist of our time. And I have been either lucky or unlucky enough to observe it, having grown up in a different era, having grown up with a different set of values. And now we're at where we're at. In any event, thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, many special thanks to my patrons, many special thanks to my donors on PayPal. You keep the channel alive, you keep it going. Without your support, the channel could not exist. And as for everybody else, if you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, apparently helps out the channel. Be much appreciated. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.